Welcome to the second part of administering storage. Now in this part of the session, we'll look at blob storage and work our way through on how to create and work and manage our blob environment. Now, first thing we are going to look at is recapping on what is blob storage used for. Typically, as we mentioned before, blob is where we bring all our unstructured data type. This could be your binary data, text data, images, media files that you might be looking to manage in your environment. Now, there are some common users listed on the screen, so you can pick some of the examples from there. Things like you might be looking at a streaming video or audio solution. You might be looking at distributing access for your files that you're stored in one place. And this is something that you can do within a blob environment. Typically, part of your storage account would mean that you go and create a container. Now, within the container, you get to create different blobs of different resources that you're bringing in. Now, you can have unlimited number of containers in your environment, so you're not constrained by a number of containers you can create in your account or storage account. And also, each container can then also offer you unlimited number of blobs you can create within that environment. Now, let's have a quick look at some of this on the portal. Right, we're back onto our storage account in the portal. So we earlier on created Contoso AZ104 demo storage account. All I'm going to do is scroll down a little bit and look into my storage options and go into the containers. Now, as we can see at the moment, I have no containers available for me to work with. There is a default container there available for me to have logs created for my storage, but we'll leave that as it is for now. Now, let's start creating a new container. We can give it a name that we want to work with. Let's call it pictures. Oh, apologies. Capital letters are not allowed because it's compatible with legacy solutions. So we'll go with lower cases. So we'll call it pictures. Now, as we do this, notice some settings that are grayed out for me at this point. So we have issues with anonymous access level, and we'll talk about some of this just in a few moments, and we'll go into our settings to have a look at how we can change some of these settings around. For now, this is going to be restricted for us to configure. So let's create this, and then we'll go into changing some of this for the next part of the session. Let's hit create, and I have a container ready. Now let's start bringing in data into this container as part of our blobs. Now, for me to bring data into this, I am now currently in my picture container, and I have some options over here to look at managing my container. We'll talk about some access details around this just in a few moments. For now, we are looking at creating some or bringing some data into this. For this, let's bring in uploading some files. Right, as we click on that, I can see I've got some data available in my environment. I can select multiple files. By all means, these are all demo files, so I'm not releasing any information out that's personal, like credit card details or client information, just sample data to bring into my environment. So I can see I've now selected 8 files to bring in. If I already had similar files in here, I can choose for these to be overridden if I'm obviously making sure that I have different types of files with same names. I can choose not to. That's again something I can decide at this stage. Along with that, if I take on the advanced option here, I have certain other options to explore. By default, this is going to be placed in my blob environment as part of block blob. Now, if I'm looking to bring in other solutions like my page blobs that I mentioned before, so you could switch them around and choose an option that suits you well in your environment. Now, just for this part of the demo, we'll leave this as a block blob and we'll upload it. Also, notice that this is still working in a hot tier, and we haven't yet spoken about what these tiers are. So let's talk about these just in a few moments. Now, for this part of the session, I am simply going to upload these and bring these files into my environment. So now I have these files uploaded. If I wanted to see any of those files, I can simply click on them and I can see a quick detail around the file. When was it last uploaded? What type of file we have? Where is it placed? And all sorts of other details around it. Now, we could look into controlling or adding versions to this file, but we haven't enabled version control, but we'll talk about that just in a few moments. We'll look at what version control is and how this can be quite useful if you're managing multiple versions of the files, which can be enabled in your blob environment. But before we get onto that, let's come back out of it and let's talk about some more details that are important to understand. Now, first of all, let's go back a step and talk about the tiers, the access tiers. Currently, I'm bringing these files into my storage account in a hot tier. Now let's jump back onto the slides for a minute and discuss what these tiers are and how they work. All right, we're back onto our slides. Let's have a quick look at some of these options that we have when we're working with access tiers in our blob environment. Now, a few things to bear in mind. As I see my blob tier options over here, there are 4 options listed on the screen. When we were creating the storage account, we had only 3 options visible for us to look at. Now, typically when you're looking at these tiers, when you're working with files that you are constantly working with, typically these files are going to be kept in what we refer as a hot tier. This is a normal occurrence or normal tier to have in your environment. So you're constantly using these file types. Now, organizations keep a lot of different types of data in their storage accounts. Not all data is going to be used all the time. Now, if you have certain data that you're not going to be using and you want to still retain that into your storage accounts, it might be worthwhile looking into moving your tiers. These tiers come at a different cost. We'll have a look at the costing on these just in a few moments. We could decide to move some data into different tiers, and we can decide to say, hey, let's move this data into cooler tier because we will keep this slightly cheaper, or have this data placed into the storage account a little cheaper. However, the lower we move on to these tiers on the screen, so from hot to cool or cold or archive, the storage becomes a little cheaper. However, the access to this data, the data transfer, becomes a little bit more expensive. That's why keeping the files that are constantly accessed and data transfer is happening in hot tier would be more advisable. However, if you're not accessing them and you want to store the data type in your storage environment, then it's advisable that you move down the tiers from hot to cool or cold, and or archive them if you're not going to look at these files for longer. Azure does require you to store these files in different tiers for a particular time period. Now, most of the time, if the files are in hot, there's no limit onto you keeping them in hot. However, if you're not using these files, you can move them into cool tier. But for the files to qualify for the cool tier pricing, you must keep the files in the cool tier for 30 days at least. You can retain them for much longer than that if you needed to in the cool tier, but minimum requirement would be 30 days. Similarly, if you decide to move them from cool tier to cold tier, which means you're now less frequently going to be accessing or infrequently going to be accessing these files, then in that case, you could keep them in the cold tier. However, the files must be kept in the cold tier for 90 days to qualify for being a cold tier. Now, if I move a file from hot tier to cold tier and keep it there for 5 days and bring it back out into hot tier, then again, the duration of the whole file moving to cold and back to hot, we might still end up paying for the hot tier, or the additional charges may apply to this because you're moving between tiers, but you're not keeping the data in that tier for the duration it requires. So please make sure you understand some of that before you start moving the tiers. The last one that I have on the list over here is the archive tier. Now, typically when you create the storage account, it doesn't give you this option to begin with. However, once your account is created, you can decide to create an archive tier where you can decide to move your data into archive. As the name suggests, this is you archiving your data. Typically, you're not looking to work with this data anymore. Something that you need to retain, you need to store for longer periods of time. However, you're not necessarily looking to work with this data. Ideally, you should keep it in archive. This would be the cheapest way of storing data. However, the access to this data might be a little bit more expensive. Along with that, you can see that it requires you a longer period of latency if you are looking to access this data. Typically, if you look at that documentation, this can be anywhere between 14 to 16 hours or more, depending on the type and the size of the data that you're retrieving. So it's very, very important to understand that if you have archived the data, you can't simply click on it and start looking into it. It would be completely, it won't be available to you to work with. It's something that we refer as dehydrated data. So you have to hydrate it before it's available for you to gain access to it and start working with it again. Now, if you're keeping your data in an archive environment, then you must retain that data in archive for a minimum of 180 days for it to qualify for an archive data. Now, let's talk about this a little bit more on the whiteboard. Right, just looking at some of those details that we mentioned on the different tiers in the blob environment. This is a quick comparison table that you can find on the Learn documentation for the blob tiers. At a quick view, you can see the availability of my data in the hot tier is slightly higher, so it's 99.9%. However, all the other tiers are still at 99% availability. So that doesn't make a huge difference, but it's a slight difference in that, depending on your need. So that could impact on the kind of solution that you're looking at. Now, along with that, if I look at the latency, typically people assume that if you're moving from hot tier to a different tier, you might have a higher latency. But in this case, if you're keeping your data into cool or cold tier, the latency is not different by much. You're still looking at milliseconds as latency to work with. However, this changes when you're looking at data that's in archive. Like I mentioned, once you archive the data, it could be a few hours before you can get this data available. Once it's hydrated, you'll have access to it. The minimum storage times are important to understand for them to qualify for these tiers. As mentioned before, 30 days, 90 days, and 180 days for archive tier for them to be retained in that storage to qualify for that. Now let's jump onto the Learn portal and explore some more details and understand a little bit around the pricing as an example. Right, if you go into your search engine and search for blob prices, we're looking for one of the links that is on azure.microsoft.com talking about Azure blob prices. Let's land into this page and see what type of pricing that we'd see. Now, if I scroll down onto this page, just to get an idea, we can define what type of storage that we're looking at. We can choose a redundancy solution. So in our scenario, we're working with LRS. We can choose a region that we want to work on. Let's switch this to UK South, as this is where the storage account that we've created. Since we are working in UK, we can keep the currency in pounds. However, you can choose to switch this around to a currency that makes more sense to you. And we can scroll down into looking at different solutions. Now, if I scroll down here, there are some tables that we can work with. However, it's important to understand these are pay-as-you-go prices. And if you work with different pricing in your environment, you might want to refer to your own price list. Now, as a quick example, just to understand some of this, let's pick the very first line and just to understand how things look like. You can see for the first 50 terabytes, how this works for me. Now, the premium account, we said it's going to be the most expensive. However, per GB, it's only looking at roughly 14 pence or 14,505, looking at the pences there. And if we compare the other tiers, so if you look at the hot tier now, per GB for me to keep this data in a hot tier, it's 0.0147 pence per GB. Moving on to cool tier, it's even cheaper than that. You can see the numbers changing, even harder to call them a pence. It's less than a pence, so it's 0.00849 per GB in the cool tier. Cold tier gets even cheaper, so you can see the number change from 0.008 to now going into 0.00348 pence per GB. And if I place that into archive, that gets even cheaper for me to look at. So we are now dropping down to 0.00139 as per GB cost. Now, obviously, you can carry on looking at calculation of your data depending on the size you have. But just to give you an overall idea that this is your storage cost that you might have in terms of storing the data. So it's cheaper if I move from hot tier to cool to cold and archive. So if I have no need to keep this data in hot because I'm not accessing it and I'm just going to keep it there, then it's worthwhile me thinking of moving tiers in this case. Now, one more thing that's worthwhile looking at, if I scroll further down onto the same documentation over here, it talks about the operations and data transfer. This is where I mentioned the access to the data. If you are going to be constantly working with this data and utilizing this data, then you have the operations and transfer cost that is added to these resources. Again, if you wanted to compare this in terms of me working with the data that's in the hot tier, it's slightly cheaper as you compare this to cool or cold tier. So you can see the price goes up for me in some of these areas. So again, working with the archive tier to retrieve this data and work with this data is slightly more for me to look at as compared to my hot tier. So if you are constantly working on this data, it might still be worthwhile keeping it in the hot tier. But if you're not and you're just using it to store somewhere, you might move down the tiers and save costs on storing this data. Now, let's jump back onto the portal. Now, as we create these files and keep them in different tiers, again, like I said, when you're uploading them, we had an option to choose different tiers within the blobs that you're working with. You can manage it that way. So for instance, if I upload a new file, let's go into Browse and then choose something that I haven't already got. So let's bring in a new file here called hash. And if I start looking to bring this file in, I can go into my tiers here and define this is going to be kept in the cold tier. So I'm not going to be working with this too much, but I just need to store it. But remember, in the cold tier, for it to qualify for that, it must be retained there for 180 days for it to be part of the cold tier. Apologies, it should be retained there for 90 days. 180 days is for my archive tier. So again, getting those numbers right. So making sure that if it is in the cool tier, it's 30 days, cold tier is 90 days, and archive tier is 180 days. All right, now once I've done that, I've kind of created my blob, I've created my data. A lot of the time, organizations will have a lot of different type of data available for them to work with. It becomes a little trickier for someone that's managing the data in your storage account to understand which part of the data needs to move different tiers. We don't want this to be a full-time job for someone to constantly do this all the time, going through the files and checking which files they need to move to different tiers to save cost. So could we do something different? Again, talking about the least admin effort in scenarios to make sure we are achieving things by simply doing tasks that can minimize our effort. Now, for us to do this, let's explore one more solution in here. Now, on the portal, if I take a step back out and look at my containers, or actually my storage account, and I scroll down in my blade for my storage account and look for something over here called lifecycle management. We can simply go into the lifecycle management, and this is where we can start creating different policies that might help us, or rules that might help us to manage some of that for us. Now, earlier when we were creating the storage account, one thing that I mentioned was that you need to enable tracking if you need to see who was last accessing a file or a data type that you have. In that case, if you are going to monitor some of that, for us to enable lifecycle management, we might want to tick that as well if we are looking to create a rule based on last access to the file. So for now, we'll tick this and see how the lifecycle management can help me in managing some of these tiers for me in my environment. Now, what we can do is we can go and create a rule. We can create a rule, give it a name. Let's call this lifecycle management or lifecycle management rule 1. And that's what we are calling this rule for today. However, make sure you create better naming conventions than I do in my demos. All right, scope for this rule. Am I applying this rule to all the blobs in my storage account? By all means, you can limit this. You can choose a particular blob that you might be working on. And as soon as I choose the limited blobs, you can see it comes up with an option for me to choose the base blob. So you can define, it shows me the filter, set filter option that can define which part of the blob am I looking to bring within this policy. So we'll have a look at some of this option just in a minute. Apart from that, if we apply this rule to my entire storage account, we can work with that as well. So we'll look at both these examples at a very quick overview, and let's move on to this. Again, within this, we have some other options to choose from. Things like, am I working with block blobs or pen blobs in this case, or am I managing this for just the base blobs that I have, or if I'm looking at snapshot or versions, which we'll talk about a bit later as part of the backup of my storage. Now, let's move on to the next part. In the base blob part, we have some options to choose from over here. Now, like I said, if I did not enable the tracking, the last access option would not typically be available for me to look for. So if you want that option to be available, ensure you enable tracking. I could go by last modified, I could go by created, so you can look at when it was created and since then, and you can also go by last access, which might make sense that if I am working with a file and I want to ensure that people are still opening and working with resources that we have in storage, since no one has accessed this file in a certain period of time, let's start moving this file across. Again, you might have other reasons for it. Maybe if a file is created after a certain period of time, you want that file to be moving onto different tiers based on different compliance standards that you might want to work with. Now, in here, we can go with one of the examples. Let's choose last access and let's move with that. Now, let's assume that this file was last accessed, put it down, let's say 15 days ago. So it's been 15 days, nobody's accessed this file. Then I get to choose what would happen to a file in my entire storage account with all the blobs that I have currently. Well, we don't necessarily want to delete this straight away. We could decide over here to say, hey, move this to the cool storage for a duration of time. And in this case, we can then carry on adding other conditions if we are not done with this process at that stage. We can say, if that's the case, it's moved into storage. And since it's been moved to the storage account and nobody's accessed it in the cool storage account, then let's move it to a different tier. And for me to do this, remember for the cool tier, we need to keep the files in there for 30 days. So we'll say minimum 30 days. So it's been 30 days, it's been in cool. Nobody's accessed this file yet. So let's move it again to a different tier. Now, again, we can keep on doing this process to move it to cold storage, a number of days. Like it says, it must keep it for 90 days in there. And if you're moving it to archive, must stay in there for 180 days. So we could do that. We can go through all stages. We don't have to. We can jump straight from any one of these tiers to say, hey, we're moving on to archive straight away. So at any one point, we can jump between the tiers. We don't have to go from hot to cool, and then from cool to cold, and then from there to archive. We can go straight from hot to archive, or from hot to cool, hot to cold, and then archive. A choice that you have, depending on your needs. Now, I can move this to archive. Now, remember, when we are moving this to archive, we are going to keep this data in archive for a duration of time. It does suggest that please ensure that you know that this data is going to be kept there with a higher latency. So you need to understand that this data will need to be first hydrated to a different tier for you to be able to access this, which can take a bit long time. So you can read into the documentation here that explains the time, which is in hours. So bear that in mind before you start doing that. Now, maybe you have certain other compliance standards that suggest if the data has been in your environment for a certain period of time, after that duration, you might need to get rid of this data. So we'll go by 180 days because that's the minimum requirement for us to keep the data in archive. So let's assume it's been in archive for 180 days and I don't need this data anymore. So I am going to start looking to delete this data from there, or delete this blob from here, from this environment. Now, again, you might have different policies, different ways of working with things. You might want to retain it for longer than 180 days in an archive. You might not want to delete this data straight away without going through some other checks. So that's entirely up to you and how you manage this. Again, this tool is there for you to work with your lifecycle management of your data within your containers. So managing your blobs in a way that suits you best, rather than you manually moving them around and shifting between the tiers. So this could be a nice tool to look at, and we can hit into add into creating this. Now, if I take a step back out for a minute and say, hey, I want to do this for a limited blob only. So in that case, I can go in here and, like I said, the top option to filter the sets becomes available. And here I can start typing the name of the container. For example, we said picture. So I can say this particular policy simply applies to my picture blob that we have, and we're working within that. Now, if you create further other paths within the filter, like I said, typically your blobs are flat structure, doesn't necessarily like working with folders and subfolders. However, you can still create that structure in there with what we refer as paths. So you can create a path in here to have your container name and the path that you have within that. So maybe a folder-like structure in here. But like I said, typically this is not what the blobs are designed to do, but you can have that structure in here. If you were doing that, typically this is how you would do. So your container name / the prefix of whatever resource that you're keeping in here, and then you can start adding this particular lifecycle management for that particular resource. Now we'll leave this out for now. Let's go back in. Let's say we're applying this rule to my entire storage account for this demo, and we can go next and we can simply hit add and simply create that rule that will help me manage my storage for this account. Now, apart from creating a lifecycle management rule for your blob and your containers, what we also can look at is talking about object replication. Now, at a quick overview to understand what object replication is designed to do, it helps you in replicating your objects to a different region. Now, you could do this for multiple reasons. You could be looking at a solution that is creating you a disaster recovery plan. You could also be looking at bringing a solution closer to your users. If you have users in different parts of the world and different regions, instead of them accessing this data across different regions, you can create a replication or a replicated object within a region that's closer to your end users, and they can see this data closer for them in the region they live nearby. Now, again, this could be used for many other scenarios. If you're working with, maybe you can keep the primary source of the data where you're processing a lot of information, and the results and the reports that come out of it, you might want to replicate that where people can pick that information from a secondary region or a second region. Or you might look into processing all the information and archiving that data, yet keeping the reports available for people to see in the main region and pushing that particular information out onto the second region. So you have a few different options there to look into object replication. Now let's look into the portal on how this can be done. Now back into the portal, let's click on the object replication to start looking at the options to create this. Now, when we are in object replication, we can start creating a replication rule for us to define how it will replicate this data for us. Now, a few things that we need to define is creating a storage account in the secondary region. So it will ask you to choose a destination storage that you might have in your environment. Now, I can pick one of my existing storage solutions that I have. For instance, if I go into a storage account called Hyena 7, so that's a storage account that I've created as another demo. So I can say, hey, this is the destination storage that I will bring this data into, and we'll start replicating this data. Now, I can choose a particular container that I need to replicate rather than the entire set. So I can define to do that. So for example, we can go into say, just replicate pictures for me, and it will go into a container in the other side. I have currently got a container called Bob's Blob 1 as a container name. So I could decide to do that. I can go into my other storage account and create exact same name, so I can match where the files are going. So I can go and create another container there called picture, and then replicate that to that destination. So again, an option that I can choose from. So let's for now say we are replicating this to Bob's Blob. And once we have chosen some of these settings, we can hit create, and this will start creating a replication policy for me to decide that this data is going to be replicated for me in my storage account that we have in the secondary option. All right. Once you've seen the object replication, as you saw, the demo is pretty straightforward, depending on you deciding where you're choosing your second region to replicate this data. Just choosing some of the options would be important, and planning it out before you implement, because implementation is typically very, very straightforward. So make sure you plan that out and then decide what are you replicating to a different region and the reasons for you to do that. Now, once we have understood the tiers for my blobs, understand the lifecycle management for them, looking at options to replicate these to secondary regions, some or all the blobs that I have, so I can plan into looking at some other details that could be very, very important for us to work with. Now, earlier on, when we were doing the account creation in the previous session, one of the things that we looked at was an option to access my storage account, and we left it unchecked. Now, what we are going to do in this part of the session is we are going to go into the properties of my storage account and enable that feature to see how that works. Now, before I do this, let's jump into my container and start looking at the current container that we have. So we created pictures earlier on, and within the pictures, I can see this particular container, if I try to change the access level to it, is grayed out. So a feature called anonymous access is currently unavailable, so I can't see that. So under my settings, you can see I have an option to go into configuration. Some of the details that we were configuring as part of the storage account, we can see them back in here again, and we can go and change certain features. One thing that we can't change, obviously, is changing the storage account option from being standard to premium. This is something that we define at the stage of creating a storage account. It can't be changed. However, other things that we can look into talking about, the area that we're discussing right now, is to look at blob access with anonymous access enabled. Now, let's enable this for just a few moments and go back and talk a little bit more around on what this actually means and how this works. Now let's hit save onto this and switch back onto my blob option to see if I can now make changes to my access tier. Now back into my container, let's click on my pictures, and within my pictures, if I go into my access tiers, I can see now I have some more options available to choose from. Now these options are very, very important to understand. If you're providing somebody a direct link to your storage account, particularly looking at your container blobs, then in that case, they should be able to open that link to, or the end link to go into that particular resource that you're sharing. For instance, I want someone to be able to look at this entire blob or this individual blob that we're working on, or the entire container, which is in this case the pictures. So if I want them to be able to look at the entire container, browse through this, do some look at some of these pictures or data or files that I have, I might want to share the entire container. In this case, let's try, say we give someone a blob access in this case, and it says the container can be read by anonymous requests. It's warning you that anyone that is not currently authenticated but has the access to that particular blob that you're sharing with, they can open this. Now let's try and see what that makes, what difference does that make. So if I, for example, look at this particular document that's in here called credit card details, and I click onto it, now I have a URL for this. Again, hoping everyone remembers the URL path should be very similar or familiar, because we've mentioned how that should look like. And all I'm going to do is open this in a new tab. Now, as I open this in the new tab, you can see that it's given me an option to download this file, obviously suggesting it can't open it, but I have the option to download this file and look at it. So if I click on download file, it should be available for me to open and work with it. So I have access to this file without authenticating, without doing any further details, because I've created an anonymous access for this particular resource. Now, this can be pretty concerning in terms of security if you don't want people to be able to get into your resources without any particular secure method. This is a feature that you don't want to enable. Hence, the portal gives you a warning message there to suggest that. Now, let's go back and change the settings one more time. Now, if I don't want anyone accessing my pictures container, all I can do is go back in here and say, let's take away this access. So they won't be able to go into this. Let's make this private and make sure there's no anonymous access onto my entire container, and try the same file again. Once that's changed, let's go back in here. Let's copy this link one more time, and let's open this in a new tab. Now, as you can see, if I try and open a file with anonymous access turned off, it simply doesn't allow me to see that file anymore. And this is something that we can plan as part of creating anonymous access or denying anonymous access to your files. Again, if you're looking to secure access to your resources, something that you might need to consider as part of managing access to your container. So again, a feature that you might want to keep turned off if you don't want people to access your storage account as part of that. Now, along with accessing your storage account, one thing that's very, very important to understand, and this is something that we will need to discuss a little bit more in detail. I mentioned earlier on with the storage account session that we need to create a storage account. In our case, we created a storage account using access keys. We could decide to have access to my storage account based on my Entra settings. Now, if I go back into my pictures container for a minute, currently the access method is using access keys. I can decide to switch this to using a Entra authentication method. However, currently it's giving me an error message because there are certain RBAC roles that we need to enable for us to be able to do some of these. And that's all this error message is suggesting, that I don't necessarily have those particular permissions added to me. Now, for me to do this, let's quickly have a look at my RBAC settings on my storage account. In fact, we could do this on the blob itself. So let's go back into the picture blob and go into my IAM or access control. And all I'm going to be doing is looking at a particular role for the data object. So we're assigning a new role. So what I'm going to do is click on add role assignment, and let's look through the list for blob data contributor. Now, this is one of the roles that we are looking to implement. So we have a blob data contributor role. Now, this is one of the roles that you might require to manage some of these settings that we are looking at. Obviously, you can go by the least privilege access and choose someone to have blob data reader role if they're just going to access this resource using the Entra and not change or contribute with you. However, I'll apply this role for now. Just bear that in mind. Now, I'll select myself as a member onto this and give that role to myself. And say select, and let's hit assign and assign. Now, once I've assigned this role to myself, let's go back into my blob. And now if I want to switch this access, maybe just give it a minute before it kicks in. Right, if we now go back and refresh this and try to switch this to an Entra user account, you can see it's now switched. So it suggests that users using their Entra account now should be able to do this, simply because I've now assigned myself a role on the storage and on the container to be a blob data contributor. So now I can look into doing this. Now, if I'm allowing others to be able to read this data from this particular storage account using their Entra, I might need to give them a minimum of a blob data reader role assigned to their RBAC. So once they authenticate, they have the right permissions to be able to read the information from this blob. All right, now, apart from this, let's switch this back to the keys for a minute, and let's talk about some more details into the keys in my storage account. So let's go back into my storage account one more time and go down the blades to look at the access keys. Now, earlier on, I mentioned that when you create a storage account, your storage account is encrypted by default. So Microsoft is already looking to manage your storage account in an encrypted state. So data at rest in the storage account is encrypted. Typically in the back end, you can see there are two different keys that are managed within this account that will be helping you with some of that. So you don't need to particularly create them, but they are there available for you to look at. So I have a key 1 and key 2 to look at in this stage. And again, it also brings in the connection string available for me to look at if I am bringing this as part of my development tools for different solutions. I can bring in the connection string to connect those resources to kind of utilize the storage as part of that setup. Now, ideally, if you're working with storage solutions and you're plugging in your keys, it might not be advised that you take this key directly and embed this into the code of an application or the connection string directly into that. That's, again, not a best way of doing things. Typically, you might use another solution like your Azure Key Vault, as mentioned before in the course, that it would be a better place for you to maintain your keys. So this is something that you can maintain your keys and build a connection from that, from your application, to kind of look into gaining access to your storage account. So it is ensuring that this information is not shared or kept anywhere open in the code somewhere. Now, apart from bringing Azure Key Vault as a solution, a lot of the times you'll see developers using both keys rather than just using one key as a solution. So you can provide both the keys in your solutions. So for instance, let's assume one of your keys now is exposed, or something has gone wrong with a solution that had that key embedded into it, and you're now required to change this key. Now, typically the term that we'll use is rotating the key. It could be that you have an internal policy that after certain days you rotate these keys. Currently it says their keys have not been rotated. We just created the storage account, so this is 0 days old. However, after a certain number of days, you might require to change or rotate your keys. Now, if you're doing that, and if I had a solution like this running in my environment, typically if I only had one key assigned to my solution, now when I rotate the key, for the time that this key is not available for the solution to look at to gain access to my storage account, this particular solution will be broken. It won't be able to access the storage account to gain whatever it is looking for. Now, to avoid that downtime, what you can do is you can provide both the keys to your solution. So while one key is rotated, your solution will carry on working with the other key. And once you've rotated one key, again, it's advisable that you rotate both keys and not just one in your environment. Obviously, you're not rotating both at the same time, one at a time. Once you've rotated the key, take the new key, provide that back into your solution. So again, you'll have an updated version of that key available to look at. Once that's all done and everything is working fine, it might be time for you to now rotate the key 2. And again, you can go back and update the key 2 once that's rotated in your environment as well. So again, a nice way of looking at key management in your environment. Currently, my current storage account setup is looking at managing or accessing using the storage keys. Again, if you prefer this not to happen, you might want to start looking at different solutions. Now, this brings us to this part of the session. We'll discuss a little bit more into securing my storage access with some other features under my security solutions over here in the next part of the session.